Okay, hopefully when you were working on your homework, you realized that you should have answered these questions on this slide, even though they're not in smaller print like on other slides that you've worked on. So what is ecology? Well, there are two main words or vocabulary terms that you want to keep in mind when you think of what ecology is. And echo comes from the Greek word ekos, which means home. So it's the study, and ology is the study of, so it's the study of our home. And it's the study of interactions between everything that's within our home. And when we talk about our home, we're talking about the earth, right? So ecology is the study of interactions between every living thing on the planet, in general terms, and the interconnectedness between every living thing on the planet. So these are the two keywords that I'm talking about: interactions, interconnectedness. Interconnectedness is a huge concept. Actually, the state standards, there's the whole state standard that has to do with ecology, they use this term to designate that standard, interconnectedness. So it's a very important concept to understand just how connected every living thing on the planet is, including humans. So this interconnectedness and these interactions are between living, which hopefully, I think you've already learned in previous science classes, biotic refers to living. There's that part of the word bio, which means life. Just like biology is the study of life. and also interactions between non-living components of the biosphere, and that is referred to as abiotic. So in biology, you're going to see this a lot. If you put an A in front of a word, it means the opposite of, or not, or no. In this case, it's the opposite of biotic, abiotic, non-living. The other question here is, how do ecologists study ecology? Well, the problem is that ecology, these interconnections and this interconnectedness is extremely complex. It's a very difficult field to study. It's trying to understand something that's extremely complex. And so what ecologists do to study ecology is gather information and then try to organize that information into models that represent these complex systems so that they can make predictions. And the best example, and the example that you're going to learn about most here in this introduction to ecology, would be a food chain or a food web. Food chains and food webs are models. They're diagrams, right? When you draw a food chain, you draw a food web, you're drawing a diagram, and that diagram represents how energy is transferred through an ecosystem. It isn't the ecosystem itself, it's a model of the ecosystem, right? So that's a model. But using that model, you can make predictions. If you remove an organism, a species from that food chain, you can predict what's going to happen to that food chain. Further along in that food chain, same in a food web. If you remove an organism from that food web, you can make predictions about what's going to happen to the rest of the food web. Or if you just increase or decrease populations of certain species within a food chain or a food web. So that's an example. This diagram you don't have in your copy. It's just a very general diagram, and it actually has to do with societal issues, modeling in society, but it applies here too, because societal interactions are as complex maybe not as complex, but are complex, similar to ecological interactions. And this shows the hierarchical nature. So we've got the individual here in the middle, so you can apply this to ecology by thinking that individual is an individual organism, which is living within a population that's part of a community within an ecosystem. That ecosystem is part of a biome, and that biome is part of the biosphere. So notice the arrows in between each level here showing the interactions between levels. So there's interaction all the way from the individual to the biosphere and back. And that leads to this concept of the hierarchy of ecological organization. And that might sound familiar because previously we talked about the hierarchy of biological organization. The hierarchy of ecological organization is just a portion of the hierarchy of biological organization, because we can go below in the hierarchy of biological organization. We went below the individual level to the organ systems and organs and tissues and cells and organelles and macromolecules and atoms and subatomic particles. So you can go below. You can't go above those. So this is like the upper part of the hierarchy of biological organization. But this is the part that ecologists tend to study most, from the individual up through the biosphere. So the individual is a living thing. One individual, one living thing, like the example that we see here. But the thing to keep in mind is that one individual, just like you, is interacting with the biotic and abiotic components of its ecosystem. It's part of a population. Individuals are part of populations. So what a population is, here's our I'm trying to make these definitions as brief and concise as possible. And I'm sorry that it's kind of hard to see the red against the diagram here, but it's all interbreeding individuals of the same species within a community. Those two words are important, the red ones. All interbreeding. If they're not interbreeding, they're not considered part of the same population. And they have to be the same species to be considered part of the same population. But that's within a community. And all the populations within a community are interacting. Right? So these double arrows again representing interaction between levels. The community represents all the populations of different species within an ecosystem. So the interacting component, the interacting biotic, I'm sorry, I missed that word too because it's hard to see. The interacting biotic component of an ecosystem, in other words, all the life within an ecosystem represents the community. And what it is all the populations of all the different species that are living within the ecosystem. That's the community of that ecosystem. It does not include abiotic components. When we talk about the community, we're talking about just the living components of an ecosystem. However, ecosystems also have abiotic components. So it's a biotic community interacting, there's the arrow, right? Interacting and interconnected with the abiotic environment. So the ecosystem includes both biotic and abiotic components. Just the biotic component is what we call a community. And it's made up of populations of all the different species that live within that ecosystem, which is made up of the individuals, which is made up of individuals of each species. If we go on, ecosystems come together within these large geographical areas that we refer to as biomes. And a biome is a geographic region determined by climate, soil, and community. And you tend to get certain ecosystems within certain biomes, but biomes include a lot of different ecosystems. So again, that's kind of the hierarchical nature here. Many individuals make up populations, many populations make up the community. Communities are part of the ecosystem. Many ecosystems come together to make up a biome. And then finally, the biomes all come together. All the biomes on the planet come together and interact to form the biosphere, which represents all life on Earth. All life, every single living thing, from the smallest bacteria to human beings, to elephants, everything that's living deep in the ocean, deep underground, and they found life as far down as like 2 miles in the Earth's crust, all the way up in the atmosphere, because there are living things, that fly, but also there's, bacteria, just bacterial spores and things that are found high in the atmosphere. So the biosphere represents all life on the planet. and all of it's interacting at all different levels. And so this represents what we're talking about when we're talking about a model. This whole hierarchy of ecological organization is simply a model that has been created to help us think about and study and communicate about ecology. Climate has a great effect on the Earth and the life on the Earth and how that life is interacting. And you know that it's a big topic these days because of climate change. So the role of climate is important when considering ecology. And when we talk about climate, it's different than weather. Weather is short term. You watch the news and they talk about the weather, what the weather's going to be that day, what the weather's going to be for the next 7 days possibly, but that's relatively short term. Climate refers to long term. So we talk about the average temperature over the year and the average precipitation over the year. So those are the two components. The two components of climate are temperature and precipitation. You'll notice that the format that I'm using here is a little different than you've seen before. It's just that I already had this ready to go, so I thought I'd use it. So those are the two components of climate. When you're talking about climate, you're talking about the average temperature over, from month to month over a year, and the average precipitation. And we'll be looking later on at these things called climatograms that show the average temperature and the average precipitation over a year in various places that represent their climate. Climate, the effect of climate, again, the role of climate is what we're looking at here. And climate is what determines soil. Soil characteristics are largely determined by the climate. A good example is what we're looking at right here in this image. This is a desert, and it's got very sandy soil. But that sandy soil, you wouldn't think of it, but it's very high in nutrients. It's very high in mineral content. So that if you were to add water, you could very easily grow plants here. The only reason that plants aren't growing here is because there's not enough water, which is a component of climate, the precipitation. There's a very low precipitation. And that has led to types of soil, the sandy soil, but very high in nutrients. So climate affects soil. The soil then affects what plants can grow there, the producer community. And the producer community affects the consumer community. In other words, what animals can live in that ecosystem. So climate, it all starts with climate. That's the role of climate. Climate determines ecosystems, the type of ecosystem that can exist in any region on the planet, or you could say the type of biome that can exist on any region of the Earth. And again, climate is a big component of what makes different biomes, which again is something that we're going to be looking at coming up. But the role of climate is huge. I skipped over this example, leaching. You may have heard of leaching before. When we're talking about leaching, we're not talking about a leech, like attaching onto your leg of the parasite and sucking your blood. We're talking about when there's very high rain, very high precipitation, it washes away the nutrients from the soil. So again, a desert has very nutrient-rich soil, whereas the rainforest, for example, has very nutrient-poor soil. So what is going on with climate change? Well, one component of climate change, or one way to understand climate change, and climate change isn't complicated. What's going on here isn't complicated at all, and it has to do with this thing called the greenhouse effect. So you may have heard of the greenhouse effect, and some people confuse the greenhouse effect with climate change or global warming, and they're definitely not the same thing. And so that's what I want to emphasize here in kind of a simplistic way. The greenhouse effect, you want to remember, is actually good. It's not bad. Climate change, on the other hand, global warming and climate change, those do mean the same thing. Global warming and climate change is the change in the climate that we're experiencing now as the result of human activity, and that is bad. So Greenhouse effect, good. Global warming, climate change, bad. Because it's not supposed to be happening. It's only happening because humans are adding to the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So how does that work? Well, here's the sun. Sunlight strikes the earth. The heat that we feel from the sun is not like the heat that you feel when you are near a fire. The heat that we feel from the sun arrives as visible light, electromagnetic radiation that we refer to as visible light. And that radiation starts molecules moving. For example, when it strikes your skin, it gets the molecules that are making up your skin moving, and that is heat. The movement of molecules, it is heat. And so that's the heat that you're feeling. It's caused by the electromagnetic radiation, the energy being absorbed by the molecules in your skin, causing them to move, increase their kinetic energy, which is heat. Heat then is re-radiated from the Earth. Some of it escapes the Earth's atmosphere and goes back out into space. Some of it is blocked by gases that are in the atmosphere, and those are what we refer to as greenhouse gases. And there are a variety of greenhouse gases. And there are a couple big greenhouse gases that we are adding to the atmosphere. But the main one is carbon dioxide. IR here stands for infrared. So heat, the radiation that's being represented here by the red arrows, is infrared radiation, and that is heat. So heat, some of it gets, a lot of it gets reflected back out from the Earth's surface. Some of it gets out through the atmosphere and leaves. Some of it gets reflected back or held in, trapped by greenhouse gases. And the one that we're most concerned with is carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide has been added to the atmosphere ever since we started burning fossil fuels back in the mid-1800s. So fossil fuels are the culprit. So you can see this is relatively simple. If we stop burning fossil fuels and we stop increasing the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere, we should reduce the amount of infrared radiation that's being trapped by the atmosphere, allowing more of it to escape, therefore cooling the Earth. But right now, we're still burning a lot of fossil fuels, adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, cutting down trees, deforestation, which is removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that's increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and trapping heat, making the Earth warmer. It's that simple.